Justice Marie Garrett was a teenager from Florida who mysteriously disappeared after school. The police were tasked with solving this challenging case. The more they delved into the details, the more they uncovered the chilling motives and the sinister scenario orchestrated by the criminals. The brutality and coldness with which the killer carried out one of the most horrific crimes in the county's history sent shockwaves through the community. Friday, April 13, 2018 would go down as a truly ominous day. It marked the start of a tragedy that would force law enforcement to work harder than ever before. Just 3 weeks after her 16th birthday, Justice Garrett went missing. On that day, she was preparing to go to school, with plans to spend time with her friends afterward. That morning, however, Justice overslept and woke up later than usual, causing her to miss the bus that picked her up from the stop. Her mother, Danielle, 37, was busy getting her younger child ready for daycare and couldn't help her oldest daughter get to school. According to Danielle, Justice left for school on her own, as she normally did. She was expected to return home on the school bus later in the day, just like every other day. But when the time came, she didn't come back. At first, her family didn't worry. Justice had many friends and often stayed with them after school. It wasn't unusual for her to be delayed. But as time passed and she still hadn't returned, her parents began to feel uneasy. They weren't overly concerned at first because they knew Justice sometimes stayed the night at her best friend's house. Since they both had to get up early for work, they went to bed without waiting for her. However, when they woke up the next morning and saw that Justice hadn't come home, Danielle's worry grew. Her daughter's bed was empty, and she couldn't reach her by phone. She immediately called the police to report her missing. The authorities took her case seriously and began their investigation. Detectives explored various theories about where Justice might have gone. While they were accustomed to teenagers going missing and often returning after a few days, this case felt different. Danielle had a strong sense that something was wrong. Her daughter hadn't contacted anyone, which made her fear the worst. Unlike typical cases, the police didn't wait for news from the missing girl. They launched an immediate search. As investigators looked into Justice Garrett's disappearance, one of the initial questions they faced was whether she had simply run away. According to family members, there had been some noticeable changes in Justice's behavior over the past few months, typical struggles that many teenagers face. The family had recently moved to the small town of Sorrento, Florida, with a population of less than 1,000. The town was known for its warm, gentle climate and beautiful nature. Justice had switched schools, and as a senior in high school in the middle of the academic year, this could have been difficult for her to adjust to. It wasn't uncommon for teens in similar situations to feel overwhelmed, lose control, and retreat into their friendships during tough times. Justice could have stayed with friends over the weekend after her Friday classes. However, her mother, Danielle, rejected this idea. She firmly believed that Justice was too responsible and mature to simply disappear without telling anyone. Justice often helped with her younger sibling and never acted impulsively. She didn't have any reason to run away from home, especially when facing problems. She was accustomed to confronting them head-on and always discussed any overwhelming issues with her mother. Additionally, all of Justice's personal belongings were still at home. Danielle insisted that something had happened to her daughter and urged that the search for her begin immediately. Despite reassurances from law enforcement, Danielle's anxiety continued to grow. She knew her daughter wasn't the type to fall in with the wrong crowd or run away. If Justice had stayed with friends, she would have called her parents to let them know. But her silence, ignoring calls and messages, including those on social media, was completely out of character. Justice was friendly, sociable, and didn't use illicit substances. The idea that she'd suddenly leave without informing anyone seemed far-fetched. The police checked databases for any criminal records or traffic accidents involving Justice and confirmed what Danielle had said. There was no criminal activity linked to her, nor had she been involved in any accidents. The search began in earnest, with officers reaching out to her friends and classmates. They interviewed dozens of teens, which led to a flurry of rumors circulating on social media. Some claimed to have seen Justice sleeping on gravestones in a cemetery, while others suggested she had run off to live with a secret boyfriend. Much of this information was fabricated. Teenage girls, driven by the desire for attention and popularity, spun wild stories to make themselves the center of attention at school. In reality, Justice had no boyfriend and had never shown an interest in hanging out at cemeteries. As rumors about Justice Garrett's disappearance spread, a group of her close friends who truly cared about her began to push back against the gossip. They worked hard to debunk the wild stories circulating, and on several occasions, confronted the most notorious gossipers. One of these girls was even temporarily suspended from school during the investigation. The case not only disturbed Justice's family but also rattled the entire town. The community was in an uproar, and many people, though concerned, tried to help with the search efforts. Yet despite their best efforts, there were no leads. Despite these challenges, the police were able to narrow down the list of potential suspects to a reasonable number of people who were closest to Justice. Among them were her closest school friends, who were immediately called in for questioning. The authorities hoped that by speaking with them they would soon find Justice alive and well. However, what they uncovered drastically changed the course of the investigation. After interviewing everyone who knew Justice, including her friends, teachers, and classmates, the police learned that she never actually made it to school on that Friday. This meant that she had vanished earlier in the morning, shortly after leaving home. Surveillance footage along Justice's route and her phone's geolocation data confirmed that she had indeed left for school around 7:25 a.m. But between the time she left home and the estimated arrival at school, there was a roughly 30-minute gap. During that window, Justice completely disappeared. What had happened to her during that time? 4 days after her disappearance, on April 17th, a man who was out on his morning jog called the police. He had noticed an unpleasant, unfamiliar smell coming from the side of the trail. His curiosity led him toward the forested area nearby, where he discovered something that would change the investigation forever. After running just a few meters, the athlete stumbled upon a human body. The man didn't waste time investigating or disturbing evidence at the crime scene. Instead, he immediately called 911 for emergency assistance. Police officers arrived at the tragic discovery and found a woman's body showing signs of severe decomposition. There was minor evidence of animal activity and the effects of hot, humid weather. However, the majority of the damage to the body appeared to be caused by exposure to some kind of chemical substance. Forensic experts determined that the substance was likely a bleach-like chemical, which had been poured over the victim's body. This was clearly an attempt to conceal evidence and traces of the crime. The victim could not be immediately identified at the scene. A lab analysis was required, but investigators suspected that the body might belong to Justice, the missing woman who had been the subject of a widespread search. The upper part of the body was severely disfigured by chemical burns, but even in such a state it was clear that the young woman had not died of natural causes. Police were only able to confirm the victim's identity as Justice after analyzing her DNA. Her remains were discovered in a wooded area near DeLand, about a 30-minute drive from the city of Sorrento, where she had lived. The upper part of her body was so badly decomposed that only the bones remained exposed, while the lower half was somewhat preserved due to her pants and shoes. Additionally, there seemed to be less chemical exposure in that area, sparing the lower body from severe burns. The exact cause of Justice's death couldn't be determined due to the body's condition, but suffocation seemed the most likely cause. The attacker had pulled her pants down to her ankles and her sweatshirt was pushed up to her neck, suggesting the possibility of sexual assault. Unfortunately, the bleach had destroyed much of the evidence, making it impossible to prove this theory. It was evident that the victim had been struck in the face several times, as her nose had been broken in multiple places. Police questioned the runner who had discovered the body and called 911. He provided valuable information. According to the man, when he ran near the body on the 16th, he noticed another person in the area from a distance. From the build and the posture, it appeared to be a man. However, the witness couldn't provide more details because the attacker fled when he heard the approaching athlete. The runner found the stranger's reaction strange, so he made a mental note of it. But he didn't approach the scene that day and only returned the next day to find the body. The runner was cleared of involvement in the crime after a polygraph test and confirming his alibi on the day Justice disappeared. To gather more information, detectives thoroughly examined surveillance footage from all locations along Justice's route, particularly near bus stops where she might have boarded a bus. According to the victim's mother, Justice had gone to school on her own. However, the police soon discovered that this was a lie. In fact, that morning, Justice's stepfather, Robert, had agreed to drive her to school. He was heading to work as a carpenter and laborer, a job that had recently been difficult for him to maintain as he struggled to secure full-time employment. The detectives were puzzled as to why the mother had lied about how her daughter got to school. As a result, they decided to question her more thoroughly. This time, she changed her story and confirmed that her daughter had not gone alone. Robert had indeed driven Justice to school in his car. The mother explained her initial lie by revealing that Robert's driver's license had been suspended. She was afraid that he would face legal consequences if the police found out the truth. At that time, they were still hopeful of finding Justice alive, and the mother believed that her small lie wouldn't hinder the search for her daughter. Unfortunately, there were many similar deceptions in the case, and the investigation faced significant challenges in reconstructing the events. Next, the detectives requested surveillance footage from the school's parking lot, where Robert was supposed to have dropped off Justice, assuming he had indeed given her a ride. A bus, which took students to school, also stopped in the same area, and Justice was supposed to have taken it after missing her stepfather's drop-off. Curiously, during the exact window of time when the main players in the case should have appeared on the cameras, there was a technical failure and the footage was not recorded. As a result, it could not be determined whether Robert had dropped Justice off at school. However, dozens of witnesses confirmed that Justice never arrived at school. No one had seen her that day, raising doubts about whether Robert had actually gone to the school. In any case, Robert was the last person to see Justice alive. As her mother's partner and stepfather, he was the only one who knew what had truly happened. On April 29th, Robert confessed that he had never dropped Justice off at school as planned. Instead, at her request, he drove her to a neighboring town and dropped her off at the entrance to the city so she could meet someone. According to Robert, Justice had begged him to do this. He believed the person she was meeting was her boyfriend, someone she had been seeing secretly, even from her mother. Robert agreed to her request, hoping it would improve his relationship with Justice and help him gain her trust. Robert admitted that he never questioned Justice about the details. He had recently started a relationship with her mother, Danielle, and he wanted to make a good impression on Justice to continue seeing Danielle. He didn't know the name of the friend Justice was meeting or any other details about him. Justice had assured him that she would get to school on her own and planned to return home by bus, so Robert was confident everything was fine. He couldn't wait for her, as he had to get to his job as a laborer in Volusia County. He simply didn't have time. The police were stunned by this revelation. Neither of Justice's parents had heard of this mysterious person she was supposed to meet. They feared he might have been the last person to see her alive, and possibly involved in what had happened to her. Despite extensive questioning, neither her mother nor her stepfather had any useful information, so the detectives turned to Justice's friends. This led them to the first important clues. None of her friends knew about a boyfriend, but they revealed that recently, Justice had been talking about a guy she'd met online. She had connected with him through social media, and he had been actively messaging her. Justice had shared some of their conversations with her friends, but she was uncomfortable with his excessive attention and didn't seem interested in dating him. The police reviewed Justice's social media profiles, analyzing likes, comments, recent followers, and messages. They found a particular account that had been messaging her frequently over the past month and was very active on her page. The account belonged to an 18-year-old guy with a muscular appearance who had been flirting with Justice, complimenting her and asking to meet in person. Although the guy claimed to live nearby, the police couldn't find anyone who resembled his photos in the area surrounding the girl's home. None of Justice's friends recognized him either. Despite his constant attempts to connect with her, Justice never responded to any of his messages. The police were certain this online account was a key piece of the puzzle in solving the crime. The detectives thoroughly examined the social media account and information of the persistent young man. They were able to trace a phone number connected to the account. To their shock, it wasn't an 18-year-old boy behind the account. It belonged to Robert Kern, a middle-aged man. Robert was Justice's stepfather. The investigators couldn't believe their eyes. Not only had Robert raised their suspicions during his initial interrogation, but now all evidence seemed to point to him. They returned to question him again, the same man who had seemed so eager to cooperate at first. However, this time Robert's attitude had changed completely. He refused to communicate any further. The police officers pressed on, as they now had evidence showing that Robert had lied during his earlier testimony. All leads seemed to be converging on him, and he had become the prime suspect in the murder of his stepdaughter, a teenage girl. Despite his resistance, the police arrested Robert Kern and conducted a full investigation into his background, trying to connect him to the brutal crime. Of course, the social media conversations alone didn't provide enough grounds to accuse someone of murder. At the time of the investigation, Robert had become almost like a family member, having been in a relationship with Justice's mother, Danielle, since the previous fall. He often stayed overnight at their house and was in regular contact with the family. There were no signs of inappropriate behavior or any evidence of Robert mistreating Justice. At least Danielle didn't know of any such behavior. Justice, however, had kept quiet and hadn't told anyone. Robert continued to deny any wrongdoing, insisting he never harassed the girl. He claimed his messages on social media were just poorly timed jokes and explained his persistent compliments as attempts to boost Justice's self-esteem. According to Robert, he thought Justice would enjoy receiving attention from a man. But this explanation sounded completely absurd to the investigators. Justice hadn't responded to his messages, and in fact, she had ignored him completely. She considered his attention creepy and had referred to him as crazy when talking to her friends. To dig further into the case, detectives decided to interview Justice's closest friend, Rochelle. Rochelle explained that she and Justice had grown especially close recently, spending a lot of time together, with Justice often staying at her house. During one of these visits, Robert came to pick up Justice. He asked Rochelle if everything was okay with Justice and when she planned to come home. This visit seemed to scare Justice even more. Afterward, she decided not to go home that night and instead stayed at Rochelle's place. According to Rochelle, a few months before the tragedy, her friend started staying over so frequently that it became suspicious. It seemed like she was trying to avoid spending nights at her own home. In the last few months, Robert had been staying at Danielle's place more often than usual. Could his presence have made the victim reluctant to stay at her own home? Rochelle mentioned that Justice had spent almost an entire month at her place just before her death. She also noted that her friend had become more nervous. Where she was once calm, now she would flinch at any sudden touch. Justice indirectly admitted that she was afraid of her stepfather. The best friend recalled in her testimony that she had seen Robert on the day Justice disappeared. According to Rochelle, he looked terrifying. His gaze was so intense that she was genuinely scared. Afterward, she couldn't help but think she understood why Justice had tried to spend so many nights at her place. However, Rochelle couldn't quite pinpoint what exactly about Robert seemed suspicious or frightening. Despite this, investigators realized they were on the right track. The detectives decided to dig deeper into the main suspect's background. They analyzed his social media conversations and phone records. What they discovered was truly stomach-churning. It turned out that Robert had a long criminal history, including 2 break-ins in the early 2000s. A review of his search history over the past month revealed disturbing searches for substances that could induce unconsciousness, including chloroform. He had also attempted to purchase these substances, and it seemed he had been successful. Additionally, the perpetrator spent a long time studying maps and nearby forests, seemingly searching for the perfect place to hide the body, while also looking for ways to erase any traces from it. He had learned about bleach, which was later used to clean the victim's body. Detectives examined the criminal's mobile phone geolocation on the day the girl went missing. It turned out that he hadn't dropped her off at the bus stop or at school, nor had he left her in town to meet an unknown young man. Instead, Robert deliberately drove to the forest where Justice's body was later found. At this location, his phone remained stationary for a long period of time, about an hour according to law enforcement officials. Initially, Robert claimed he was headed to work around Volusia, but this turned out to be a lie. He had taken his girlfriend's daughter to the woods, where he presumably assaulted, raped, and killed her, before proceeding to cover up the evidence. New evidence allowed prosecutors to charge Justice's stepfather with her murder. He was held in custody until the trial began. The exact motive for the crime remains unclear. Robert never revealed it even by the end of the trial. The prosecution believed it was a case of murder with the intent of rape. Robert refused to testify in his own defense during the trial, but he never admitted to the crime. Despite this, the prosecution had enough evidence to charge him with murder. During the trial, Robert's extensive criminal history came to light. He was first arrested in May 2019 in New York State on charges of fraud. Since then, He had been held in Volusia County Jail without bail. It was proven that in 1999 he committed his first crime, a burglary, for which he served 18 months in prison. 3 years later, he committed another burglary, serving an additional year behind bars. All of the perpetrator's statements turned out to be lies. He had claimed he dropped Justice off near the school early in the morning, and also insisted he worked as a carpenter. Both of these claims were debunked. Once the deception was exposed, Robert began coming up with new excuses, but it was all a lie designed to confuse the investigators. Detectives were able to track exactly the movements of the intruder and his victim. They matched all the time periods. His cell phone and correspondence allowed them to conclude that he had been preparing in preparation for this crime. The prosecution believed that the girl had no chance of survival, any chance of survival from the start. Robert wanted to commit murder, a piece of vegetation from the area where the body was found. The body was found in the perpetrator's car, even though he claimed he'd never been in the area. However, he had been here at least twice. After he committed a brutal crime, the man returned to this location later in the day. His cell phone was pinged in the area for a short period of time on April 16th. Presumably that's when he arrived and doused the body with a chemical to cover his tracks. And that's when he was seen by a jogger who later found the body. At the time of the crime, the defendant was 43 years old. The prosecutor's office tried to prove that his assault was sexual in nature. He kidnapped a teenager to rape and brutalize. The defendant had a long-standing fascination for Justice, but she avoided him in every way possible, rarely showed up at home. And Robert kept trying to take advantage of her, and one day the moment was right, and he got what he wanted by taking the life of 16-year-old Justice. Justice's mother, shocked by her daughter's murder, by her roommates testified against him. She claimed that Robert was the one who prevented her from calling the police immediately after of her daughter's disappearance by convincing her that she was just having a sleepover. Then he asked her to lie about Justice had gone to school on her own. The mother initially didn't understand why he asked her to do that, believing that he feared repercussions and that he was being without rights. After deliberating on the case, the jury reached a verdict in just over half an hour. In their opinion, Robert Kern was guilty of first-degree murder of a teenager. He received a life sentence without the possibility, parole, as well as an additional 5 years in prison for attempting to obfuscate the investigation. Throughout the trial, he never once pleaded guilty, never showed remorse for what happened. Despite the obvious evidence, the perpetrator insisted on his innocence and accused the authorities of arbitrariness.